Hello and welcome to this video. Today we're gonna covering the history of all cameras from the 1900s, all the way up from 1905 up until 1996 down at the end there. We got 90 years of camera history here today, so I'll show you the evolution of cameras and all the amazing technical advances they made throughout the century. So first of all here we'll start in 1905. So this camera right here is a vest camera. It was pretty nice for its day. It cost about $10 to $12 when it was new, which is a couple hundred in today's money. As you can see though, it is totally wood inside. It's missing the spools, but mostly wood, metal, and then some leatherette. Some of the wood's actually cracked. It's not the best quality, but there are some metal bits. There's only 3 different shutter settings, just one speed here. That's the hold open. Then you can see, you can adjust the aperture here. So it's a decent camera really, but nothing too fancy. And then here's the back part right here. This leatherette still, it does have a window, so it was paperback film. This was 616, so only about 8 pictures, which really isn't that much. Then in 1910 here, we have they had these types of cameras in the early 1900s as well. This is just a 1910 example of a Buster Brown, which is a camera marketed towards kids. This is about $2 when it was new, so this is a much more typical camera. And it really shows the quality is quite less. It's just leatherette with cardboard, then the inside is all made out of wood. Almost no metal except for the little fixtures here like the shutter. Shutter works both ways, which is weird. I think that's the only camera we have that does that. Sights are built into the camera, so it's made to be as compact as possible. But still wouldn't be quite as compact as this one, which is just fold away nicely. And then here we have 1919, so the cameras are going on fairly well now. This is a autographic camera with 2 shutter settings. They are getting a bit fancier with the shutter settings there. It also has an adjustable focus here, which none of the other cameras really had before that time. It was mostly just fixed. Only 3 settings for the focus, but it's better than nothing, that's for sure. And this camera here, it has an autographic function, so you could take a picture, then you could write in the back what's going on when you took that picture. So if you see a picture that's 100 years old and it has writing printed into the negative, you know it was taken on an autographic camera. And now we'll move on a little bit more. We'll go on to the 1920s. This one is similar to the Buster Brown, it's just a bit bigger. All cardboard with metal inside those. They are going for a bit more high quality materials. This is another about $2 camera. Very basic, just wind the film here. No real settings. I think there's a bulb setting so you can hold the shutter open, but that's about it. The shutter only works in one direction on this one too, so that's a bit nicer. And now we'll go on to the 30s, where we have quite a radical change, as you can see here, because during the Great Depression money was pretty short. They're trying to make cameras as cheap and small as possible. This takes something called 127 film, which means the pictures are really small. The sight is super simple here. Took about 12 pictures I think, so it's better than the 616, which only took about 8 pictures. There is no shutter settings or anything on this. It's totally made out of Bakelite as well, which is an early form of plastic. Cost about $1 when it was new, so it was a very cheap camera. These things sold well and they made them into the 1940s, I believe. Now, although people didn't have much money in the 1930s, we did have some nice cameras like this one going around. This one, as you can see, has the focus adjustable on the actual lens as opposed to the accordion, which is one of the early examples of this type of focus being used. It goes up to 100 feet. It's a pretty effective focus, and it has 4 different shutter speeds going up to 100th of a second, which is faster than the other cameras we showed earlier, which are about 25 to 50th of a second. This one too is also designed a little bit nicer. As you can see, the other ones, they're all totally plain, just covered in leatherette, all black, but this one does have some nice designs on it. So at that time they were trying to sell higher quality cameras with all metal parts made to look good. And now we have a bit of a different one here. This is an 8mm. This is actually a movie camera here. So this one did about 16 frames per second as the very first 8mm movie camera designed for civilian use, since during the 1930s they only had 16mm movie cameras. So then when this thing came out in 1934, they decided they're gonna have 8mm movie cameras. That way they can make a much smaller camera and it could take twice as many pictures for the same price. So I mean, it was very economical, and this was really the first civilian camera that average people could use. As you can see, the sight's just built into the handle. How it works is super simple. You just wind it up and you can take that, or you can lock it in position. It'll keep going. Really have to wind it up a lot though. And then the f-stop is just this here. It has a little description that'll tell you what kind of conditions you should use the f-stop for. It's serial number 42,000 it looks like. So they made tons of these things. I think they made them until about 1942. So this thing was being made for almost 8 years, which is really impressive as far as the camera goes. Now I'll have a look here at a post-war camera from 1949 about. As you can see, this is the first camera we have here that was not made in the US or Canada, which kind of helps to show how the camera industry was changing at that time, because you weren't just having Kodak just dominating the market like it was. Now we have other competitors coming in from Europe. This one is a very simple and cheap camera, just a regular low price camera. It still takes 120 films, only 8 pictures on this one, but it does have a filter, which is a bit of a nicer feature for a box camera like this. It also has a lens built inside, which is nicer than the other ones, but overall just another standard camera. Now we'll go on to the 1950s here, where we have a built-in flash camera. It's another 127 camera, so about 12 pictures, which is pretty good for something like this. It does have a big flash unit, which helps to show that these cameras were getting a bit more advanced. It's actually the only non-black camera we've seen so far as well, which, as you can see, it's styled much more nicely compared to the Brownie here, which is just totally black. They were trying to make them a bit nicer. They weren't just big black boxes. Now we'll go on to an 8mm movie camera here, another one. This thing is a Japanese camera, and it's pretty complicated. There's lots of switches and dials on it. Now it has a You'll notice it has 6 lenses, and the 3 little lenses are here are for the actual sight. So when you rotate it, the sight picture will turn up differently depending on what lens it's selected on. It has 3 main lenses here because they didn't really have telephoto lenses back then. So they had to have a whole rotating array like this to adjust the zoom. But nowadays you just have one giant lens that you just rotate to zoom, but back then you had to have multiple different lenses rotating around. Up here you can also see that this is an actual light meter that's built into the camera. This first came out in the 1930s, but it was about $300. But in the 1940s and early 50s they started having cameras that had these built in that were reasonably priced. The technology is getting better. And how these work is you just look through the sight and it'll automatically show you what kind of light reading it's getting. I don't think it's working on this camera though, unfortunately. But here we have a working example right here. This is also from the 1950s, so a lot of cameras didn't have them built in because they were a bit of an extra price, but this thing, you just point at the light source and the dial will start moving, then you just adjust it on the actual camera, so you'd have this separately. That's how most light metering worked back then. And we have another big advancement here with a Polaroid camera. This thing was made in about the 1950s, I believe. The first one came out in 1948. This is the second or third model after the original, I believe. It is a pretty standard camera, but you can tell it's much bigger, and the film strips would go in here, then you'd take a picture, you'd pull it out, the rollers would crush a development pocket, then those chemicals would develop the film in about a minute, which is a big advancement when you consider that developing would normally take days to get the film back. And you just had the regular films. This was a big advancement, although the film and cameras were significantly more expensive. It was a big upgrade, really. Then we'll go on to another significant advancement for movie cameras. This right here is a super 8mm camera, which had a Instead of taking the difficult to use film reels, we just have a cartridge that you just pop in there and it'd be ready to go, which made it much easier for average Joes to use, because otherwise you'd have to be fiddling around with the film. A lot of the time the film would get ruined because it's difficult to use. With this thing, just pop it in, hit the button, it's ready to go. This came out in about 1964, and that's when they first got the Super 8 cameras going. So it was quite an improvement for using this big awkward double 8mm type of thing. Now we'll move on to the 60s again. Here's one of the latest 620 cameras ever made here. It did have a flash unit attached. It only took about 12 pictures, but as you can see, this was about the pinnacle of what these tiny little black cameras were like here. And then if we go into the 70s, we can see there's a big change. This is an average, fairly nice camera. As you can see, it has a huge amount of settings on it. It goes up to 1,000th of a second. You can change the lenses here. It has built-in light metering through the sight. It doesn't have autofocus, but apart from that, very high tech when you consider the other cameras. This one wasn't too expensive, but this is definitely a fairly professional photographer, but not a bad camera really, or not. And we have a more average camera here. It's another Polaroid. This is a giant, it's the biggest camera we have here. It just folds out like that. And this thing also has an automatic light meter inside of it, so these things were becoming much more commonplace. It also has an easy to adjust focus, because when you look in the sight picture back here, it'll have two different pictures, then you just slide the focus back and forth. And then it'll basically autofocus it for you, which is a big help, considering how difficult it is to focus these things when you're just doing it by hand essentially. Then we'll go into the 80s. Now, by the 80s, the cameras really were getting a lot cheaper. This was just an average camera here, so there's a big jump from the 60s to the 80s here. Now, this is one of the very first cameras to ever use an autofocus system. This is the whole system up here. It's pretty big, but you just press the button. The lens will automatically move when you take the picture, and then that autofocuses it. It's also one of the very first cameras to have an automatic film winder. As you can see, there's nothing up here. It's just a motor, so you turn on and the film would wind up. So really, if you want to shoot this thing, you just go click, 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 then it'll just keep advancing, auto-focusing and metering all the shots, and they should come out decently well. It's basically an almost fully automatic camera there. And we have a late version Polaroid here. This is from the 1980s as well. It's a pop-up thing. This actually has a sonar system right here. This is for autofocus and metering, so this is another almost fully automatic camera. It also automatically prints out the pictures when you get them, so it almost works like a printer. Here's the cartridge in there. You just pop in the film and just take a picture, and it prints it out, and in a couple minutes you have a picture that's all ready to go. Fair amount of settings back here, which kind of shows that some of these cameras were getting a bit complicated again, but they really worked well. And now we'll go into the final stage here, which is the 1990s. Here's a fairly standard 1990s camera that someone with a bit of money could have for fairly cheap. It has a digital display on it, as you can see here, which is a new thing for the late 80s and early 90s, so all the information about the camera will be shown up there. You have a bunch of different settings up here, and you can have a lens that can be removed. Then this is a telephoto lens here, which is pretty handy to have, so you don't have to have multiple lenses going. You can have filters attached to it, and it actually would have a date and time right here too, which is another handy little feature. It's an SLR camera, so whatever you see in the sight here is what you'd actually be taking a picture of, which is a big advantage when you consider the other ones, where the sight picture would certainly not be what you're taking a picture of. And we have one of the last advancements in movie cameras here. This is just a cassette type of thing here, 1996, as you can see. So this thing you just pop, I won't talk about it too much, but you just pop in a VHS tape here, and then you'd have a camera that's all ready to go. Much more easier than film cameras. Not sure exactly how it works, but cheaper and easier to use, that's for sure. because those 8mm cameras are quite a pain. And this thing is almost fully digitalized, and it has a 12 times zoom, which is a big deal when you compare it to the rest of the cameras. So thank you for listening if you stayed through all that, and I hope you learned something about the evolution of cameras here. It's definitely a very interesting topic to look into, and hopefully we'll look into each individual camera at a later date here, because there's still plenty to talk about.